to head over. Oh, thank you, Zoom. Head over to Asali. Thank you so much and excited to hear from you.
Okay, so I'm reading from my novel, The Days of Afrekete. And I'm actually going to go ahead and read from the beginning because that way I don't have to set anything up. Late one April afternoon, Lizelle stood at the large kitchen window, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Gripping the phone to her ear with her shoulder, she acknowledged that early spring was her least favorite time of year. Letting that idea settle, she felt herself slide down into one of the chairs at the cluttered kitchen island. She had intended to stand and take this call, keep a straight spine and spacious diaphragm, but found she could not. Jail, Lizelle. They're going to put his ass in jail. But Ma, she said, half expecting to see a cloud of steam come out of her mouth. It was not cold enough for the heat to kick on, and yet the air inside her 150-year-old home in Northwest Philadelphia felt icy. Just because the FBI said something doesn't mean it's true. What about Martin Luther? Lizelle's mother, Verity, let out an acid whoop of laughter. You sound insane. Do I need to say that Win is not Martin Luther King? Shit, these days, Win up here looking more like J. Edgar, not funny, snapped Lizelle. She did feel an urge to laugh, but as if she were being tickled by someone bigger who did not love her. She imagined herself in the future, taking a panicked call from her son, Patrice, and resolved to do better than Verity was doing to comfort her, even as she suspected she would fail Patrice. We don't know if he did anything, Lizelle insisted. Yes, this guy told me they're going to indict him, but we don't know what he did or even what they say he did. The daylight was gray and the dark wood fixtures in the house weighed her down. She felt a gentle tugging, which, if she gave into it, would take her briefly out of her body. Her mother's voice snapped her back. Lizelle, are you listening to yourself? Ma, look, I just want to know if you think I should cancel this dinner party. Well, I'm not sure what's being celebrated. Is it Win losing the primary, which we always knew he would? Church Williams has held that office so long that you were buck-toothed and skinny when they swore him in. Look, the party is to thank the folks who helped us. Lizelle felt sheepish at her use of folks. She had no memory of saying the word before Wynne decided to run for office. Oh, the folks, Verity said on cue. Did you invite the folks who are going to get him locked up? Because somebody was talking to somebody, right? Lizelle hadn't even considered that she and Wynne were potentially about to host an FBI informant. Would that person really have had the gall to accept their invitation? To the point, Verity said, you want to know if you should throw a party to thank these people who had nothing better to do with their money and time than to help you delude yourselves? It wasn't a delusion, said Lizelle, her cheeks warming. She had used the exact same word, delusion, in an argument with Wynne early in the campaign, when there had been time to turn back, when she was trying to make him turn back. She was surprised and irritated to find herself defending his and her honor, but she persisted, as she often found herself doing when her mother goaded her. Look, Ma, at one point in the polls, Verity laughed. The polls? Where did he buy those polls? I hope he kept the receipts. Look, can't you just fucking say if you think I should cancel the party? Verity began to breathe. Since she'd been on sabbatical from teaching, and unpaid leave really, Lizelle had taken yoga classes with a frequency that shamed her. She had regularly tried out different studios in Mount Airy and Chestnut Hill during the city's most productive hours. In her only neighborhood celebrity sighting of Sonia Sanchez, Lizelle could not greet her, so galled had she been to be wearing spandex and clutching a BPA-free water bottle with a mat under her arm. But she had learned enough from the classes that listening to Verity's loud exhalations reminded her of the practice of ujjayi, quote, triumphantly victorious breath, unquote. Lizelle's 41 years of research suggested that no matter how distant, abusive, judgmental, unloving, and useless one's mother was, one called her when things fell apart. One called one's mother and told her things no one else knew, even if all she said in response was, "It is what it is. All I can do is pray for you. Just be glad you have a roof over your head. I told you so, but you wouldn't listen. Oh, please, he was always like that. You made your choice. You know my money is tied up in this house right now." For weeks since she'd spoken to the attractive gentleman from the FBI in the coffee shop, Lizelle had wanted desperately not to call Verity. And I'll leave it right there.
Thank you. Fantastic. Very exciting. So many places beloved in Philadelphia. Okay, so I get the great pleasure to ask both of you all some questions. And I think, as many of us always want to do, many writers in the room, many Blue Soup students, so good to see you all. I would love to hear a little bit from both of you about how these projects began. Perhaps, is it an image? Is it a character? Was it a premise? Very curious. And maybe we'll start with you, Asali, and then go over to Jocelyn.
So I'm always talking about the writer Linda Berry has all these books where she talks about craft and how to begin things. And one of the things she really talks about is starting with an image rather than an idea. And so there were these ideas that were like floating around in my head about, political wives. And I had also, had been reading about Charlene McRae, who is the First Lady of New York State, right? So she's married to Bill de Blasio, but in college, she was a lesbian poet who was also like a political radical. And I thought that was like fascinating. So those were some like ideas. But the image that started the story was of a woman in her kitchen taking a phone call from her mom, who was saying, uncomfortable things to her, right? So I really spent a lot of time seeing that kitchen and this phone call, feeling this and it basically went outward from there.
Love that.
I'm sorry.
Yes. No, go ahead. I was just going to say, yes, Linda Berry, and over to you.
I love that reading. That was so funny and familiar. Yeah, for me, because the collection's 5 short stories and a novella, they each had their own starting point. But I definitely find that I often start with something in the real world. I know you're not supposed to like rip from the headlines, but like I just didn't know that because I'm like a totally self-taught writer. So I definitely, if there's something in the world that's really agitating to me, often I'll like turn it around in my head, and if it sticks with me, and if I'm waking up in the middle of the night thinking, why is that way? I think writing for me can be at times a way to look at a question or look at a predicament or look at a moment, and just try to figure it out and figure out what it means to me and kind of write my way around it. So in this collection, in that story, Virginia's Not Your Home, it actually started with an interaction with a parent that did something to my child that really bothered me. And it just like, I just had to like exact my vengeance in fiction. And this, although it's really unrecognizable in the story, that was kind of the starting point for me, this moment where this other adult really was, not being, I thought, respectful of my child. So, and then in the collection too, there's these more political moments in Charlottesville. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and there were things that happened here. A university student who was kind of bloodied, the Unite the Right rally that happened in 2017, where we had white nationalists kind of invade our town, that were some of things I witnessed in public schools as a teacher, just moments overheard, not even to do with me, that I kind of mined for ideas as beginning points for the short stories.
Wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate the Law and Order reference, ripped from the headlines, and I think there's nothing, we all are inspired all the time by all the things happening around us. I wondered, since I think you're both really fascinating structural writers, and again, since we have some writing nerds here, I would love to hear how you think about structuring this project. If you, Jocelyn, if you want to go first and respond to that as a whole, or within a single story, up to you. And then I'd love to hear about Days of Afrekete as well.
Yeah, I love playing with kind of form. Well, I think with the short story collection, there's like, how do you structure the whole collection? But I think about it as each story kind of calls for something. So there's some tension in the story that you're thinking about. For example, the first story in the collection, Control Negro, is a story where this father's kind of justifying this very obscene racial experiment, where he's kind of trying to test America's promise to provide life and liberty to all of its citizens. And can that be true for a Black citizen? So he's kind of testing it through this experiment with his son. And that story takes the form of a letter. So he's writing his son this letter, kind of confessing this experiment to him and sharing it. And that made sense because there's this clinical distance with this character. He's a professor. He has this he's kind of saying, I'm not apologizing, but he really is. Whereas that second story, the story I read, Virginia's Not Your Home, is in the second person. It's a very different feeling story. The voice is really different. And then the novella at the end of, and I would say that's true for probably to like a big degree for each of the story. There's a story in the we form where these school children are kind of revolting, and there's a story in the form of a list because I'm obsessed with to-do list, and I have a lot of to-do lists. I have a to-do list over here right beside me. And then the novella, which takes up the majority of the collection, which is My Monticello. I really copied the form of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, because the story takes place in Thomas Jefferson's plantation home in contemporary near future times that could be now, where this group of Charlottesville neighbors are kind of rousted out by white supremacists and end up taking refuge in Thomas Jefferson's plantation home. I read that, and I'm like a really bad historian, just to say that to begin with, but I did read Notes of the State of Virginia on my Kindle late at night. I read it, and he has all these he has lists in it, which I love. And he has these just the form of it. I kind of decided this narrator, who's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, would kind of copy that, just because I just think that's kind of fun. And also it really suited this idea of this kind of urgent, there's something about it that's like a narrative where you're kind of collecting the things you love about, it's like an upside down love story, right? It's a story about what she loves about Virginia, but then under this extreme pressure. And I think Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia has a little bit of that, in the sense that it's all these things he loves about Virginia, but then there's also these obscene kind of racial observations that when we read them now, we recognize some of the tensions that are going to come to bear, both in the novella and in what he was thinking about so long ago. So those are some thoughts on form.
Jocelyn, when you say that you love lists, I can't help but wondering if any of these items from Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse are actually on your current to-do list right now. I think so. In terms of, the question was about structure, I sort of got distracted because I was listening to the answer. So, I think this novel is all about structure. It actually is structure. I think it's because what it does is it takes a sort of front story, basically the course of an evening, where some things happen, but mainly it's sort of that part is like kind of comedy of manners, although the plot of the sort of relationship between the main character and her husband certainly is like something that's an active sort of subplot in that. But generally, it's these two women thinking about their lives and in a way like ordering them in their minds and trying to like make new sense of trying to say like this is what the narrative is so far. And so the creating this story was all about writing these different sections. So what I did was, the way that I am able to write is writing scenes that are of interest to begin by writing scenes that are of interest to me, and none of the boring stuff. And then I have to go fill in various connections between things. But then everything that happens is about the relationship between these sections and how they're arranged. And so I think that the main thing I knew I wanted to do in this book was do something new with structure. And so that was like one of the things that I focused most on, was being able to create like a sort of unconventional structure that was coherent and engaging. And I think also what I was thinking a lot about was the way that memory works, and the way that memory, like how the sense you make of memory basically changes every day, right? Like, so if I have one memory yesterday, it could mean something else, and then the next day, or sometimes I'll have a memory, I'll just keep coming back to a memory and picking it over for a long time and then say, oh, that's what I'm supposed to have figured out from that. And so I really wanted to sort of investigate and play around with that in the book.
I love both those. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I have a couple questions that are specifically for one of you, and I get to ask those. And then I would love to, if you all have any questions for each other, feel free as well. But Jocelyn, I'm really curious and jealous that you got to have a novella in your book. And I wondered if you wanted to share or could offer many of us who are interested in novellas sort of any words about how the novella came to be in the book, how you see it interacting with the other pieces, and if it was tricky to convince the world to take that novella, or how that went for you.
Yeah, so I love that question. I have a novella in the book because I just don't know what I'm doing, and I just wrote a novella, and it was the last thing I wrote, and I'd already kind of, after I wrote Control Negro, in 2017 or so, I kind of came up with this idea that I was going to create a collection of these stories that were like pinpoints in the map of Virginia, and that had these kind of themes of racial and environmental anxieties, and this idea of home and longing for home in these really different ways, and possibly in different voices. And I only had one other story that ended up being part of the collection that I included. And so I was writing forward from there. And then at the end of this, August 12th, 2017 happened in Charlottesville. And a year after that, so I was still working on this collection. I kind of had this vision that I wanted to make this thing where this connection. And My Monticello actually came last. I wrote it as a short story, a long short story. And after I wrote kind of the complete story, I recognized that it needed a middle. Like, so often I'll have a beginning and an end, and then what's going to be the middle, and what's going to have readers believe that we've earned this ending, and also that this was believable. And also I had to learn about Monticello and read Thomas Jefferson's Note on States of Virginia and kind of think about how I was going to fold in this idea of history and place. And so I ended up just expanding and hoping that it could still be part of the collection. There were moments where I thought, I mean, it could be its own thing, but I'm really happy that in the end, that it ended up getting folding into it in the sense that what I love about collections is that you don't have a sense of a monolith. You have all these stories that kind of vary around a theme, and I think that can be really fun for a reader, just to look at the nuances of these different approaches at the same idea. And also there's this way that because I wrote them all within a pretty short period of time, they kind of point to each other. Like in the novella, there's a line from Virginia's Not Your Home as the title for the second story. And that's a line in the novella when the narrators read standing in the basement of Monticello, basically, and reading Thomas Jefferson's words and realizing that, her ancestors had to flee Virginia basically because of the laws concerning Black people at that time. So I like that idea of the stories pointing to one another, and like little lines and ideas from one story being echoed in another. And I didn't have to fight for it. When I went out for the book, my agent and I were kind of like, it could be this, it could be that. What are you all excited about? And I was super happy when Holt was like, we actually want it all to be a thing. Because short story collections kind of can get short shift, but I love stories, and I hope readers will consider and just read short story collections as well as novels. I think they're both really, really beautiful things to have in the world.
Wonderful. Yeah, and that you found the right home, that speaks so well of them as well as you. Asali, as I was reading your book, the sort of copy that was offered of this idea that this book was a sort of inspired by Mrs. Dalloway as well as Sula, and I think Zami was also mentioned. I wondered just if you could offer us like a little bit about working with those texts in your book. As I read on, it was like the idea of those being combined changed so much, but I wondered indeed, like, were you working with them as different frameworks? Were you working with them as sort of shape? Like, how did those texts come into your book?
So each of them has a really different kind of story. So with Mrs. Dalloway, when I started thinking about this book, I started thinking about that novel came to mind. I was interested in the structure of it. And I don't know what suggested that to me. There was no, like, I saw it or, just out of my mind, it just like was offered up like, oh, what about the structure of Mrs. Dalloway? And then I reread Mrs. Dalloway and I was like, oh my God, this is a really useful structure. But I think what it has in common thematically is that, it has these, woman protagonists who's sort of going over her life and thinking about, how she got to where she is. And it also has another, in a way, Selena is the secondary character, but a co-protagonist who's also sort of, put into motion by this call from Lizelle, is also going over her life and thinking about these moments. But Sula is, so that's one of my all-time favorite novels. And I've had an occasion to study it with different students. And recently, like a couple students wrote theses about it, like in the last 10 years or so. And always the question came up of like, what would happen if the women in the novel were a romantic couple? And so I was like sort of interested in thinking about, so because that book is about two women whose most significant relationship is with each other, but they're not together romantically. And so I was just thinking about the way they were complementary and this kind of thing. And also thinking about Zami, which sort of like arrived to the party a little bit late, but I think a lot about that book because, you can make a lot of different choices when you write a memoir, or when you write an autobiography, or she calls biomythography. But one choice that Lorde makes is to write about it almost exclusively in terms of relationships. That's the thing that propels the book. And so I thought about that. And I also thought about the way that at the end of that, she talks about this, this affair with this woman, Kitty/Afrekete, and it's like a brief affair, but it is like really important to her. And so, that came too. And I just think like one of the things that I find really enjoyable or fun or whatever about writing books is actually incorporating other books, like sort of just like weaving all of these things in. And so then I get to have more conversations about the books and think more about them, and it's a way of like paying tribute, but it's also a way of like revisiting. And I don't know, so all of those things came into play in a different way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, fascinating. And I see a couple of hands actually from our attendees, but I'm going to go ahead and ask those folks if you could put any questions that you might want to ask Asali or Jocelyn into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those shortly, I promise. So I have many things that I could ask. I wanted to make space for the two of you if you wanted to inquire anything of each other or just offer more of a comment than a question, that's fine too. But I will take a back seat for a few moments.
Well, I have one thing, two things to say. One is, one thing I loved about the Days of Afrekete was there's a way that the narrator and her love interest are outsiders among outsiders. And that really is evident. There's a scene where they go out to dance and they go to the dance, and there's like this way that they're at the beginning, the narrator, Lizelle, is like shy about holding her girlfriend's hand, and they're in this dance and they're dancing with all these dudes. And then they have this moment, and then they're holding hands going back. And I just love that. I'm just going to say that I'm a fan for the outsider among outsiders. But this is just a selfish question, but I'm curious because My Monticello is my debut book. Asali, like, how do you approach coming to a new project after you finish something, and how do you just generate the energy for the next project, or how do you know when that's the thing that you want to spend energy and time on?
I mean, the gaps between these books are so long that you don't even need to, it just like, I think it's so, I teach full time and I have two kids, and it's like I don't have to think of it in terms of like turning away, because I've basically, like, if I was the kind of person who would follow things a little bit more closely, I think it would be much harder to do. And so like right now, ideally, people ask me if I'm writing, I'm like, absolutely not, like, so I think that, like long spaces certainly automatically will ease you into the next thing, because, and I think also, there's a way that even though something is alive for a while you're going around reading it to people, after a while, then it really does begin to feel like something that's done. And, then when that closes, then it seems, it can clearly be time for like the next thing. So like when you were speaking about My Monticello as a novella, so I was reading the collection and I got to My Monticello, and it was so deeply embedded in, like, when you were like, oh, things I'm thinking about in the night, I'm like, no, you came to my house and went into my brain at 4 a.m. and you saw what I was worried about, and then you wrote a book about it. But like, I have to say, I'm gonna admit that when I realized it was gonna go on to the end of the book, I was like, oh my God. Like, it was so traumatic. I was like looking for a clean little wrap up in like the next 15 pages. I was like, oh my God. But I also think that it's like, there's something really effective. This is not a question. Really effective about the fact of the novella for that particular story. Like, I think a novel, I don't know, would have been, I don't know, like, I don't want to say too much, because, if it was a novel, you would have made it work. But there's something about the pitch of it and the subject and what's happening in it that's like, clearly not a short story of conventional length. And so I think it really works well. But I am going to have to ask you, which is like, how do you like deal with this material? Because writing about a dystopia that like is tomorrow, it's that, and also the other story about buying a house. Like, how do you make that fiction?
I think because it was really deeply worrying to me. And there was a way that not every story is this way for sure, but for those two stories, buying a house in particular, and buying a house ahead of the apocalypse, which is this woman who's kind of making a list of her desire before her 40th birthday to own her first house. She's a single mother, but also of all her fears that the world is falling apart. And so this kind of, and also like what she wants to wear when the apocalypse ends, and like how she's going to keep her hair together, and how she's going to care for her daughter, and her dreams of like the world maybe getting better, but probably not. Like, that is deeply personal to me. I was thinking, even though the details of her life are not the details of my life, I was thinking very much about my fears about the future. And also in My Monticello, I think that story really deals with environmental and racial upheaval, and our inability to deal with protecting our infrastructure in ways that I find so troubling. And so even though you would think that you wouldn't want to sit with it, I think there's a way that I had to sit with it. I didn't write that right after August 12th, but I wrote that like a year after, kind of before the storming of the Capitol, before 2020. So it was in that interim, but it was me thinking, if we don't deal with this, pardon my French, like fucked up shit, like what's going to happen, like what's going to go down. And like, it was a way for me to be like, well, you guys worry about that. Like, I can't hold all this worry my own self. So I'm going to like make it into a story, and hopefully other people can worry with me. And maybe in that way we can have some sort of agency to do something about it, because I don't think it's a one person kind of issue. So it was almost like it had that piece to it. And I don't think that's been true for things I've written in the past, but I just think these have been some hard years over here and for me. And so that was just one of the ways I like managed that. It was almost like I couldn't not write about it, if that makes sense.
Can you tell me a little bit about your ending and how we spoke ahead yesterday, we were both talking about endings. Like, did you have conversations with your editor about it? Was that your original ending? Like,
yeah, so I will, without giving away the ending, I will say that it's an ending that doesn't tie everything together and leaves you in a moment with the characters. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. It felt silly in this novel. This group of people are, taking refuge and kind of claiming Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's historic home up on this hill, Charlottesville, is kind of burning below, and these white supremacists are like the zombies at the gate who are kind of like coming for the house. And the idea that they would be victorious in the way, you know, it uses some tropes of genre, but the idea that they would like defeat the white supremacists and everything would be good seemed really silly to me. To say that this group of people would be able to do that seems silly. And so there's a way in this novel, the novella, that I wanted to leave you with these characters, hopefully that you cared about them, and thinking about what leaving the responsibility, it kind of comes back to that idea that these are my anxieties, leaving that responsibility on the reader to sit with this moment and decide what we were going to do, as opposed to what those characters were going to do to resolve everything and leave a neat tie to it, was kind of how I felt about it. And to all the people, the editors that I spoke to were interested in the book, and the people who ended up buying the book, to everyone's credit, no one asked me to have a different ending. And if they had, that wouldn't have been the publisher for me, and that wouldn't have been the place for me in the book. So I was really happy with that. I know in stories we often want like an ending that feels really satisfying and happy, but I think the ending isn't without hope, but it's definitely one where you're left to figure out what we want to do and what you want to do as a reader and what you think about it.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I think we have some excited folks who want to ask you all questions. So I will offer those, and whoever wants to respond or feels excited, please do. So Tanisha is asking and sharing with us that she published a short story collection, Love Lost Found, in 2018, that she was asked many times while touring about seeing certain characters again. And how do you each feel about revisiting characters in future pieces? And she also says, thanks for your tips and advice in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, right up until now, I've sort of been like hard and fast, like I wouldn't do that, because I tend, particularly like thinking about stories, I tend to think of stories as like the autobiography of those characters. But I've seen like so many writers that I respect writing stories that take off where others, like Edward P. Jones with All Aunt Hagar's Children, you know, which has a lot of the characters from Lost in the City. And I really love Olive Again by Elizabeth Strout. She wrote Olive Kitteridge and then wrote, so I don't know. I mean, I think like there's also maybe something about the way that like we watch television now that seems to make it more natural to like sort of re-engage with certain kinds of characters. I mean, I think partially also like in this book, I'm not saying I'm going to do this, but I was really, really into the character Verity, who was the mom. And so, you know, it's kind of like, I sometimes wonder if like she needs more, you know, like I need to do more, but in the past, I've definitely felt like I think it's something that I wouldn't do because there was like a commercial request for it, but more because I really felt interested in like revisiting characters. So
Yeah, I think if you the writer are interested, or there's something you want to say with the character, then it might really make sense to explore that. I think there's a way that just because someone's asking for something doesn't mean it's what they want. There's a way that, you know, at the end of like when you want more, that can be a good feeling depending. But if you, the writer, have like something that you want to do with that's interesting, I think that's a whole different thing. So that if people love a character and they want more of it, that's just a compliment unto itself. It means that you did something interesting. But then as the writer, you have to take that up as a separate issue. Is there something I want to say? Is there something more that I have to say right now? And sometimes there just might not be, even if people want more. If you don't have, you know, if you don't have something to say about it, it might not be the thing that you want to do right now.
I love that too. And I'm also just appreciating the boldness of calling a book Olive Again, like just your character name again, like A+. Okay.
further Olive.
Right? Totally. So good. All right. We have a question here that is just asking about challenges. So what was the hardest part of writing this book for you? Yeah, were there places where you had to break it apart, do something different? How did you get through that?
Jocelyn, you go.
Sure. Challenges. Well, writing's always a challenge. Like, just you start something, you're like, is this going to be good at all? Like, will anyone care what I have to say? I think there's always this kind of trust when you start a story. For me, I often like collect a whole bunch of energy around either a character or a moment or some image. And then I try to write, because I generally have written short stories mostly. I try to write that whole thing, even if it's really bad, in one setting, just to have like something to work with. And then kind of coming back and seeing, usually meaning comes last, like, what is that about? And then kind of coming back and trying to refine it and thinking about the language and thinking about it, if it's working. For this particular project, like Asali was saying, like this idea that I was thinking about kind of really like bad things, like hard things and difficult things and troubling things a lot. So there was a way in which I was kind of like, had to really try to think about what it would be like to have apocalypse happening all around my characters and have these characters that I cared about and love. Trying to think, well, how would that feel and what would feel really harrowing, and also how would like their humanity and what they loved and what they cared about also be revealed? Because I think when you're under pressure, it's like a war scene, there's a way that can happen as well. Put me in kind of a mood, like my kid was like, okay, all right, mom. So but there was something cathartic about that as well, but that could be hard.
I mean, I would say that the hardest part of this book was that I had to do all this rearranging with the structure, like I was telling you about before. And so there was no moment that I found particularly hard to write, but it was more trying to get a handle on the structure of the book and the coherence of the book, because also it was one of those things where every time I moved something, a bunch of things fell apart. So I would have to let people know that this happened and make this revelation. And so I think that the organization, it was like, what do I call it? Information management. The information management was like, I think for me, like the hardest part.
Totally. I love that. I was just reading this Alex Chi piece where he talks about like when you're stuck, it's like unmade decisions are holding you back. Like there's decisions you haven't made yet. I know, it's so good. So true. So you're both speaking to some interesting unmade decisions there. Fantastic. Yeah. And we have a question here. This is interesting. So there's been so much in the discourse lately about writing community and writing centers and the joys and dangers. And this question is just asking, what does writing community mean to you? So I know, Jocelyn, much of your book pulls from Charlottesville community and Asali from Philadelphia, and you're also part of the Haverford scholarly community. So yeah, what does writing community mean, and who needs it?
I mean, so I kind of learned a long time ago when I was a PhD student that like you don't write anything by yourself. Right. So, when I was a PhD student, my advisor would convene us as a group and to look at our work. But then I also had this thing where I was with these other women in grad school, and we would like go to this one woman's house and literally work together. And so I've always like really thought that like the physical act of writing with other people was like always really helpful for me. And then also having people read work. And now like I know like a lot of writers, and a lot of writers have really helped me with, like sort of reading, but also just giving other kinds of support and advice. And I think I can imagine that, a lot of things are like this, but there's something really particularly needful, I think, about, and maybe this is other artistic community, but having writing community is really, I don't see how anybody just is alone just writing things and like is able to be sort of successful and happy with that. Like, I think it's really crucial.
I agree. And randomly last night, myself and two other writers did a local library event here in Charlottesville, where our idea was like finding your writing community was what we talked about. And definitely I've been writing a long time, but this is my debut collection. And when I was writing all my kind of thank yous at the end of the book, I realized like how much was folded into this collection. Even though I didn't get an MFA, writing workshops, all the teachers, the different like little bits of wisdom that I got, a lot of like community through fellow writers in those groups. My writing group here in Charlottesville, we have a writer center here in Charlottesville. And randomly I used a lot of like what I call crowdsourcing, which is where I just like basically went on Facebook and was like, does anyone want to read this story? Like once it was at a certain place, which I found so interesting because I got these weird readers that weren't writers necessarily, and some of whom were really insightful and thoughtful. You know, you get a range of responses like, I like that. But then some people would really give you either a specific thing that was so helpful because they were an expert on something in the piece that you weren't, or like a very like MFA, like these are the things, this is what it seems to be about, you know, like, and so all of that like folds into what you make, and also kind of hastens you to make something good because you kind of create this sense of audience at every step, which can be really nice. So, and this is the sense of, you know, you don't wait till like you have a book to find community. You kind of are building community over many, many years of writing a book and not having that book sell. And for me, like, I'm just speaking for myself, I had many like years of that stuff. And so it's kind of really super wonderful and gratifying to, even though at the time I would have been like, I really just want this to sell and I want it to be successful right away. There's something really nice about all those people kind of being able to come on board when something does come together and become something that goes out into the world. So I think community is everything. I agree. Even though you write alone, you have to see how your words land on other people. And it doesn't mean you have to chase everything that they ask for it, just the same way we were talking about how you might not take a character and write another thing for them. But even knowing that someone cared about that character is going to influence how you write another character, and all of it's going to fold into your practice and the person that you become and the writer that you become. So it's huge.
Dang. Thank you. Well, couldn't have picked a better last question myself, I think, being a community-based writing center here. Thank you so much. I think that's a lovely place to wrap up this conversation. I'm going to put once more in the chat the link to support our wonderful local and Black-owned bookstore, Harriett's Books. Please support Harriet's. Please buy My Monticello. Please buy Days of Afrekete, as well as Asali's back catalog is available at that link. And reminder that the chat is open. If you want to express any gratitude to Jocelyn and Asali, please do. And thank you so much to you both for being here. This was really rich.
Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed speaking to you, Jocelyn, and congratulations on your debut. I'll see you around, Emma.
Thank you, Asali. It was nice talking to you yesterday and today. And thank you, Emma, so much. It was really nice. It was really pleasant to talk to both of you.
Congratulations to you both, and I'm excited to see your books out in the world. Talk to you soon. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.